Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another one of our daily reflections on the Mass readings. Today, September 7th, we're looking at the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. Today's Gospel is short but very significant. It's actually a Gospel reading that falls into two different categories, you might say. On the one hand, it's a miracle story, because Jesus performs a healing. He heals a man whose hand was crippled. On the other hand, it seems to fall into another category as well, what are known as Sabbath Controversies, where Jesus sparks a lot of opposition on the part of the Scribes and the Pharisees and other Jewish authorities, because some of the healings that he is performing, he's doing it, from their perspective, on the wrong day. He's doing it on a Sabbath day, which is a day of rest. All right. In fact, this is sort of a pattern in the Gospels, and I want to help us sort of see how this fits into that larger pattern. Okay. In Jewish culture, as you would expect, every seventh day of the week is a holy day. It's Shabbat, a day for rest, a day for ceasing from labors. And so that means that in the Jewish culture in which Jesus lives, in which he was brought up, in which he's exercising his ministry now, for the Jews, the Sabbath day is a day when you do the least amount of work. All right, if you look across the other 6 days, you're laboring all week long, and then the seventh day is the day when you do the least amount of work. So why does it seem in the Gospels like Jesus almost singles out the Sabbath as the day that he does the most amount of work? Jesus is constantly active on the Sabbath. Jesus is constantly doing things and doing things for other people that provoke a certain amount of opposition on the part of Jewish leaders because he's doing them on the Sabbath. So what accounts from this? Is there a reason for this? All right. In other words, we could even boil it down to the question, is Jesus really breaking the Sabbath? If he's a devout Jew and Jews are called to rest on the Sabbath, then what is Jesus doing? Well, I hope to spend the next couple of minutes trying to explain today's gospel and try to supply an answer to that very important question that presents itself to us. First, let's read the passage. As I said, this is Luke 6, verses 6 to 11. On another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them, he said to them, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So here's Jesus in the synagogue doing something good, relieving a burden from a man who had a crippled hand, and it provokes this reaction on the part of the scribes and the Pharisees. They want to know what they're going to do with him, right? They're actually beginning to plot against his life at this early stage in Jesus' Galilean ministry. So what I'd like to do is to just focus in on a couple of key details in this story, details that I think will help us to understand what's going on and what the message really is here for you and me. The first detail comes in the very first verse. There's a man in the synagogue who has a withered hand. Well, what is a withered hand? Well, the evangelist Luke uses the adjective xerah. Xerah would suggest that the hand is dried up or shriveled in some way. Okay, it's devoid of life. So we don't know exactly what's going on here, but we could envision a hand that is somehow anatomically malformed, or there's some sort of muscular paralysis. And this is a significant thing because in this ancient agrarian culture in which this Jewish man lived, to be a farmer, you needed two hands to work. To be a fisherman, you needed 2 hands. To be a craftsman, you needed 2 hands, right? Life was difficult. Labor was difficult. And so he was significantly disadvantaged by having 1 hand that was crippled. All right, so there's a physical handicap that's being dealt with here as Jesus selects this man and restores his hand. But in addition to the physical handicap, there's also what we might call a social handicap. Okay, Luke is the one evangelist. You don't find it in Matthew and you don't find it in Mark, but you do see in Luke that he specifies very specifically it's his right hand. Okay, not his left hand, his right hand. Why is that important? Because all social interaction in this Jewish world in which this story takes place, all social interaction took place with the right hand, whether it was serving food or passing and exchanging money, a purchase at the marketplace. Any sort of social interaction was done with the right hand. Okay, so for this particular man who remains unnamed in the story, this would be a source of kind of constant embarrassment, maybe even shame at some level, that there's an awkwardness about this man's dealings with the world because his right hand is incapacitated. So you've got a physical handicap. You also have this sort of social handicap. And one thing that I actually like from the Christian tradition and the way that this story is read is there's one account from the medieval monastic biblical scholar, the Venerable Bede, who sees this man as an image of our corrupted humanity. That man and woman, when they betrayed God in the garden, what did they do? They reached forth with their hand to take the forbidden fruit. And in taking the forbidden fruit, we injured ourselves. We ruptured our relationship with God. And so that's for the Venerable Bede, that's what the man with the withered hand is. It's the human race that stretched forth its hand in rebellion against God, that corrupted its own hand. We corrupted our way. All right? And Jesus comes to restore us to spiritual health. That's who this man is. That's just sort of a reading from the tradition that I kind of like. But the withered hand is a significant detail. The second significant detail has to do with the scribes and the Pharisees. You'll notice that the scribes and the Pharisees are watching Jesus intently. You might almost say they're spying on him, as one commentator puts it. Because the scribes and the Pharisees are the scholars of the law. And the law, of course, we're talking about is the law of Moses. It's the Torah. And the scribes and the Pharisees kind of self-deputized themselves as Jewish law enforcement officers. All right? They considered it and they made it their business to make sure that all other Jews were obeying the law properly. Why? Because the fate of Israel, the health and well-being of the nation, depends upon the people obeying the covenant that God made with his people. But the thing to notice here is that Jesus is clearly under surveillance, you might say. All right, if we backed up one episode, we would have just read the story of how Jesus' disciples were in the grain fields and they were picking the heads of grain and eating them because they were hungry. And all of a sudden, out popped the Pharisees in a grain field in the countryside, saying, "Why are your disciples doing what is not lawful?" Clearly, they have pinned a tail on Jesus. Clearly, they have him under surveillance. All right, it's though Jesus is under a constant stakeout. And the scribes and the Pharisees are watching intently and just waiting for that moment when they think he crosses the line so they can pounce and discredit him and accuse him of being a violator of God's law. So there's hostile intent behind this observation of the scribes and the Pharisees, all right, vis-a-vis Jesus. But Jesus comes and he knows their thoughts, says the evangelist Luke, and so he puts to them an important question. All right? And at one level, this sounds like a standard sort of rabbinic question. It's a question about halakha, which means it's a question about what are the rabbinic rules for what is lawful and what is unlawful, what is allowed and permitted, and what is disallowed and what is not permitted. All right. What is a safe way to go about obeying God's law? It kind of sounds like that on the surface, but there's something more going on. The question that Jesus puts to the scribes and the Pharisees is this: I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy life? All right. Now, there's something about that question that seems obvious to all. The Sabbath day isn't a day to do harm or to destroy life. Who would say that? Not one of the 7 days of the week are good for doing harm or for destroying life. All right, everybody could agree on that. The positive side, he's getting them to think about. What about doing good? And what about saving life? There's actually an interesting story that appears in 1 Maccabees, all right, about more than 150 years before the time of Jesus. The Jews actually had to ratify a new law with respect to the Sabbath because the Jewish people were being attacked on the Sabbath day. And because they were observing the Sabbath, they refused to take up arms, and therefore they were being massacred every Saturday, every Sabbath day. And so a ruling had to be made that you're allowed to defend yourself. The Jewish people would be allowed to defend themselves to save life. All right, that might be part of what's going on here in the background. But the significance of this question, I think, lies elsewhere. What Jesus is doing is Jesus is turning the tables on his accusers. He's turning the tables on the very people who are trying to trap him in this situation, because Jesus is letting the scribes and the Pharisees know that he knows what they're up to. In other words, the irony of this situation is that it's the Pharisees who are breaking the Sabbath law. We can all agree that you shouldn't do harm or destroy life on the Sabbath, but what are the scribes and the Pharisees doing? The evangelist tells us that Jesus knows their thoughts, number one, and two, that as soon as he heals the man, what do? They were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. And so the scribes and the Pharisees are actually guilty of plotting harm and destroying life on the Sabbath. And so the irony of this episode, the real punch that it has especially for a Jewish reader, is the fact that the scribes and the Pharisees are the ones violating the Sabbath, not Jesus. Jesus is not a Sabbath breaker. His enemies are breaking the Sabbath because they're plotting his demise on this holy day of rest. Now, Jesus, in the end, decides to call the man out into the midst. That is the man with the withered hand, the crippled hand, and he heals him. He tells him to stretch out his hand so that the hand is restored. All right? And now, the question that we should ask here is, when Jesus heals this man, is he in any way breaking the law of Moses? Is he violating the law of rest? He did seem to say that doing good would be acceptable on the Sabbath, that we should be able to agree that saving life would be acceptable on the Sabbath. Although in this case, the man doesn't seem to be in danger of dying in any way. He's simply disadvantaged in life because of a physical and social handicap. But I think the key point here, and this is something that applies to several of those episodes in the gospel where Jesus is accused of breaking the Sabbath, is the fact that what the evangelists are trying to show us is that Jesus doesn't break the Sabbath. You might say that Jesus actually bestows the Sabbath upon other people, or that Jesus is not undermining the Sabbath. He's actually unleashing the blessings of the Sabbath. Why? Because Jesus is taking away people's burdens. And that's what the Sabbath day is. When you set aside your burdens and give thanks to God. Well, what about all of the people who have burdens that it lies beyond their power to set these things aside? If you're a cripple, there's nothing you can do about it, right? If you're a paralyzed man, there's nothing you can do about it. And so Jesus selects the Sabbath day on purpose, very much on purpose, to relieve the burdens of God's people so that they can enter into the Lord's rest in a new way. Okay? So Jesus isn't breaking the Sabbath. It's as though he's bestowing it on people who have burdens they can't lay aside themselves. And so Jesus is doing, this is an act of grace. An act of grace is God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves. All right, and we see that in Jesus' healings. Jesus is actually making the Sabbath something greater, giving it greater extension, applying it to more people, enabling more people to enter into it and enjoy it. But even that is just scratching the surface. All of these Sabbath healings that Jesus undertakes actually point us to something bigger still. Okay? We could say that the Sabbath is a sign of virtually everything that Jesus has come to do. All right, the Sabbath is his mission in a certain sense. If you remember last week, we looked at Luke chapter 4, and we saw that Jesus was inaugurating this messianic jubilee. All right, well, the jubilee of release, the jubilee is like the Sabbath of all Sabbaths. The Sabbath day occurs every seventh day in Israel, and then every seventh year you have a sabbatical year, and then after 7 cycles of 7 years, you have the great Jubilee in the 50th year. And it's the year of release. Well, that's what the Sabbath is on a weekly basis, right? On a weekly cycle. Jesus is giving release, but the release he has come to give us is the release from the debt of our sins, a release from the burdens of our iniquities, our rebellions, and all those times that you, I, and everybody else have turned away from God when we have chosen self instead of the Lord. All right, we've chosen to walk our own path and not the path that he has marked out for us. And so Jesus' whole ministry is about releasing all of us from the one burden that we cannot offload ourselves, and that's the burden of our sins. He's giving us the one kind of rest that we can't bestow upon ourselves, and that's the peace that comes with reconciliation with God. All right, and that's what Jesus is all about. That's the great theological meaning of the Sabbath. And Jesus is enacting it. He's bestowing it. He's conferring the Sabbath upon the human race. And these Sabbath healings are just kind of small signs, snapshots of this larger program that Jesus has come to seek and to save the lost. Jesus has come to gather all of us into the arms of God's peace and God's rest. That's the ultimate meaning of the Sabbath. That's the Sabbath that we enter into when we enter into the glory of heaven itself. It's the Sabbath that never ends. And so that's what Jesus is about. The Sabbath is a sign of literally everything that the Lord has come to accomplish among us, your life and mine and for the whole world. I hope some of these reflections were helpful to you today. I pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.